Hello. In this video, I'm joined by a man whose contribution to Jack the Ripper studies is immeasurable. He's the co-author of The Lodger, The Arrest and Escape of Jack the Ripper. He's the main instigator and again co-author of the ultimate Jack the Ripper Sourcebook. He's the instigator and co-author of Jack the Ripper Letters from Hell. And he's the co-author of the book Jack the Ripper Scotland Yard Investigates. He's also a thoroughly nice chap. His name is Stuart Evans. So, hello, Stuart.
Hello, Richard. It's very nice to meet you.
And nice to meet you also. Now, Stuart, I think I'm correct in saying that you are responsible for bringing to public notice, or even to public notoriety, a suspect who, until you discovered him in the early 1990s, had been all but forgotten. And that suspect was Dr. Francis Tumblety.
Yes, that's serendipity, I hasten to add. But yes, it was basically the mid-1990s. I won't say he was unknown as a suspect. Certainly in Ripper circles, he was not heard of. And the big thing was, of course, when I actually received the Littlechild letter, which names him, I'd never heard of him before. And I'd like to think, having been interested in the Ripper since 1961 to actually read about the case, and having consumed just about every book that came out, that I'd never heard of the name. So I did realise when I saw the Littlechild letter in 1993 that here was something special, a genuine new suspect.
And it's safe to say, isn't it, that you didn't just find this letter, you actually bought the Littlechild letter.
Yes, I did buy it. I mean, as I say, I have to say it's sheer serendipity, because I wasn't involved in some huge research project at the time. I was obviously looking for crime items, and more especially Ripper items, and it just happened to come my way, and that's thanks to other people, because in fact it was owned by Eric Barton, who was a book dealer living in Richmond, and he'd been dealing many years, and several of the people I knew, such as Richard Whittington-Egan and Don Rumbelow, were all customers of his. And I'm quite amazed he'd never mentioned this cache of letters from the George R. Sims collection that were in his possession.
And George Sims was the journalist, dramatist, author who was working in the late 19th, early 20th century. And he was a man who, during his lifetime, built up a very detailed, very extensive true crime collection. So here you are, you've got this letter from that collection, and you're holding in your hands a letter that gives details of a suspect who, when you discovered that letter, nobody had actually heard of.
Yeah, that's correct. Now, today, when everyone's accessing old newspapers and bearing in mind how much he appeared in the papers of the time, I'm amazed nobody had actually stumbled across him before I did. And it came my way because I was directed there. Eric Barton was a good friend of Camille Wolfe, who was one of the major crime book dealers in London, and mentioned to her that he got some Ripper letters. Just that's how he described them, Ripper letters, and did she want to buy them? And she said no, she didn't, but she knew somebody who would, which was, of course, fortunately me. And so I made contact with Eric, phoned him up, and he said, "Oh, I'll send them to you." And he posted them to me, and that was on sort of receipt. Do I want them? Just send me some money. If not, send them back. It's amazing to think that such valuable items were just passing through the post without being registered or anything.
And so there you are, and this package arrives in the post, which, of course, I couldn't even imagine doing that today. It'd probably get lost in the post. But then suddenly this package comes through your door, and it's almost like a new suspect has arrived in the mail.
Well, it's quite incredible. Rosie was with me at the time, my wife, and I turned to her and said, "This is an incredible letter. It's worth a little bit of money." That sounds a bit mercenary, but obviously you do think in those terms, especially when you're shelling out money to buy these items. There are other letters which were of peripheral interest, all from the George R. Sims collection. But the important one was this one, and I recognised the name of Chief Inspector Littlechild, knew that he was very much part of the inquiry, and that he was a chief inspector at Scotland Yard in 1888, and in fact didn't retire until 1893. So I thought anything he might have to say is going to be very relevant, and of course it was.
And Chief Inspector John George Littlechild, he was in charge of Special Branch, wasn't he?
He was the head of Special Branch, yeah, and had been so since 1883. So it's sort of, I mean, in the following period, I think it was 1884, his office was actually bombed by the Fenians, that corner of Scotland Yard, old Scotland Yard, was bombed, and they virtually blew his office up. So, you know, the Fenians and the Irish problem was very large in those days, and that was what primarily he was working on. And he worked closely with the Assistant Commissioner Robert Anderson.
So he would have been in the know. He would have known where the investigation was going and what people were thinking about it.
I mean, it's obvious from what he's written that, you know, he does give quite a detailed reply. Anyone who reads the letter can see how relevant it is. Obviously, people will make judgments on their own feelings. Unfortunately for me, I've become known as the Tumblety man, which I think is a bit unfortunate, because I've always tried to be objective and stay away from any preferred suspect. Although inevitably, if you read about the Ripper, you develop your own ideas regarding a suspect, and I think we all have a favourite suspect, as it were. And certainly when I first started, 1965 was probably the year that everything gelled, when I bought the Cullen and Odell books, which came out virtually together. That year I bought them both, and that was where Tom Cullen wrote about Druitt as a suspect, and certainly in the early days I favoured Druitt as the best Ripper suspect, not having any better knowledge or sources of my own.
And then up pops Tumblety. Yeah,
many years later. After that, certainly in the sort of late 80s, when I read about the Kosminski and the poor Jew suspect, then I tended to favour him, and I didn't really have broad enough reading at that time to really decide, well, you know, how good a suspect are these people. They just sounded the best of what is a pretty poor bunch of Ripper suspects.
And at the time, did you know about the newspaper interviews Tumblety gave when he went back to New York?
No, I didn't know. Certainly, unfortunately, it was a rather drawn-out process, because I bought the letter in 1993, and it was obvious that there was going to have to be a book written about him, because he was a genuine suspect. And fortunately, I knew most of the people that I was already involved with would know something, you know, as to what does this mean. I spoke to Don Rumbler about it, and I spoke to Robin Odell, and I spoke to Keith Skinner, because Keith was a very good friend of mine, or I should say is a very good friend of mine, and several people of that ilk, you know, and certainly it looked good, and we were trying to keep it all secret at the time, because nobody knowing about it, I didn't want anyone leaping in and stealing my suspect, as it were. But I certainly developed it in the sense that because he's genuine, he needs researching. If you're going to do any book that's going to look at one individual as the Ripper, it's immediately a suspect book. So you're sort of declaring a sort of bias, really, because you've got a vested interest there, and I'd got a vested interest through the Littlechild letter. But he wasn't my suspect. He was a suspect named by Chief Inspector Littlechild. So one has to say it's a good source, it's a valid source, it's genuine, and it's good material, and has to be looked at. So I felt, in that sense, it wasn't my suspect at all. It was a suspect name. And even Littlechild wasn't claiming he was Jack the Ripper. Very rightly, he called him a very likely suspect. Now, if he's saying that, he should know what he's talking about. It amazes me that, you know, a senior officer like that, who wasn't stupid, can make a judgment on somebody he knew and was probably spoken to. He's going to know a lot more than I know, or any of the modern so-called experts know, and if he says that, then it must have some validity.
And in the letter, he makes the comment that there's an extensive dossier on him at Scotland Yard, doesn't he?
He does, yeah. He said he was a frequent visitor to London, and they've got an extensive dossier on him at the Yard, which we've never been able to find, which, of course, if Littlechild had got it, it was a special branch file, and special branch files do not emerge for public to look at. You know, I mean, they're always, relevant files have been destroyed now, so it's unfortunate.
And do you think they have been destroyed? Inevitably, there is talk of a cover-up with regard to the files.
Far be it from me to make any such imputation, but without any evidence. But I wouldn't be at all surprised if they haven't just conveniently disappeared because things were getting a bit embarrassing. I mean, there was a public freedom of information application to see anything that might mention him, even the ledger that existed, or presumably still exists, but nothing is forthcoming from official sources on it.
And do you think there might be something on those files that could still be considered damaging today? I mean, Special Branch would have been dealing with the Fenian problem, the Fenian bombings in London. So could there be something on those files that might still prove damaging to certain people today?
Well, it's a unique sort of situation with the IRA, the Fenians, the Irish problem, and England, and the feelings that run so very high. And these things do tend to stay in families. So you've got descendants, which aren't all that far back, still living. And I think for that reason alone, they wouldn't want any name to come out as perhaps somebody who, gave away information to the police of relevance to a suspect who happened to be Irish and certainly had sympathies that way, which he's stated himself.
So names of informants and things like that.
That's right, yeah. I don't think... I think when an official force, say like the Special Branch or anyone investigating these sort of problems, perhaps get an informant who approaches them and said, look, I can tell you something, but you must never reveal it, then they're duty bound to honour that, because if it gets out even several years later that this person had gone ahead on the grounds that it was never revealed that he was the informant, and then suddenly here it is hitting the headlines and everyone knows who it was, even if it's descendants who may live in different camps today, then it can, the revenge system in that case stretches down a long way through the years. And I think it would merely be a case of, like, the Special Branch have got this information on swearing confidentiality and it will never be revealed. If it's suddenly revealed by them, albeit years later, then that's then going to result in people saying, well, yeah, you might not have been able to or going to say anything at the time, but it's all come out now and it's caused all sorts of problems or fears. And I just think they're the sort of thing that they'd rather just keep under wraps and consider it's all done and dusted and let's not mention it.
And of course, Tumblety's interesting for several reasons. Firstly, we have what Littlechild says about him, that he was a very likely suspect and was obviously on the list of suspects for Scotland Yard. But, and correct me if I'm wrong about this, but we also have Tumblety's own admission to the American newspapers that he was actually arrested for the Whitechapel murders.
Yeah, we do. And the thing is that those interviews, or certainly that particular interview in the New York World, which I think was dated the 29th of January 1889, where he actually, says what he thinks of the English police, and the fact he was only there, to, like everyone else was going to Whitechapel because he was curious and wanted to see what was going on, and gets himself arrested. And to put it in his own words, he only got arrested because he was wearing a slouch hat, and the suspect was American, so therefore I must be Jack the Ripper. So he was taking it in that sort of light, and that's how he spoke of it. But when you look at it, I mean, he is a very likely suspect. I mean, he was known for misogyny. He hated women. Again, it's stated of the prostitute class, or the working woman class, and also the fact that he moved. He was there at the time of the murders. He was arrested in November 1888. A little problem is caused by the fact he was arrested on the 7th of November, and because you get the Kelly murder on the 9th of November, well, for various reasons, that may or may not have been a problem. Because there are indications that he was released on bail before the day of the Kelly murder. He said he was detained for a couple of days, and also the fact that he could have had an assistant or somebody, or as it's stated in the records on him, he used to get young men under his control, and he could have somebody else working with him or covering up for him. Or she may not have even been a Ripper victim, for which there's a good argument, because she's an atypical victim from her age and right down to the method of the murder and everything. It's committed indoors, and it's it sounds when you start making these arguments that you're proposing him as the ideal Ripper suspect. Well, I don't do that. All I say is you play devil's advocate. You put these things before people, and they must make what they think. Definitely. I'm not telling anybody to think anything. And in fact, I'd always stress that if I wrote a book, I'd try to be as objective as I could. I couldn't avoid being a little bit, I won't say biased, but sort of tendentious, because you're making out a case for a particular individual. So obviously you make out the best possible case. People can criticise that, or they can discuss it. I can't say he's Jack the Ripper. I don't say he's Jack the Ripper. I say he's a very likely suspect, which is just what Inspector Littlechild said all those years ago. So individuals have to make their own choice. However, I did move on from that to write several other Ripper books, which are noted for the fact that they are objective. And in fact, I consider, rightly or wrongly, that the source book is probably the only textbook ever written about Jack the Ripper.
And the source book is it's a book that anybody who's got any interest in the Jack the Ripper case, studying it or reading about it, it's a book that every student of the case should actually have. And the amount of information that's in this book is actually incredible. And it's interesting how you came by the information as well, isn't it? To tell us how you came by this information.
Well, it's quite simple, really. I mean, I approached by post because there were no computers when I started doing this. Well, there were computers, but the internet per se wasn't in existence the way it is today. So you were still writing sort of typed letters to people and so on. And I contacted the Public Record Office and said I was interested in obtaining copies of all the Ripper files, Home Office and Police, and I actually paid for hard copy, and it was over £1,000 I spent in getting the hard copy. And then, of course, you have to transcribe the whole lot, and Victorian handwriting isn't always that easy to read. So it was quite a mammoth task, and it went on over several years. I even had quite a manuscript going and then deleted because I was so computer ignorant. I hadn't got a clue what I was doing at times, and I deleted what I'd written, had to start again. And
so you managed to delete everything you'd written up to that point.
Don't even ask me what button I pressed, but it disappeared from the computer, and I was back to square one, starting the same thing all over again.
And you only have to take a look at the source book to understand what a monumental task that must have been. It must have been soul destroying. You must have felt like Carlyle when he had to rewrite the history of the French Revolution.
But I'd done it. I couldn't, undo what I'd done, and I had to either forget it or go back to square one and start again. But I think probably the best part of 5-6 years I was working on this, but it wasn't with an intention of writing a book. It was to back up the work I was doing initially on Tumblety when I wrote the first book, 1995, and then going on to do the other books. Where the study that Keith Skinner and I did of the letters, I think, is the only study that's ever been done of the Ripper correspondence. So I felt that was all new material and useful to people. And bearing in mind the difficulty there is for some people to do the research, either getting to Kew or transcribing or whatever, for the price of the book, they were getting all that information and it was ready done for them, researched and photographs. And so we just felt they were useful books, and they weren't trying to bang the drum for any particular suspect.
And they both are fantastic books. The source book in particular, it's the book that anyone doing research can turn to. I use it when I'm writing articles or I'm researching videos, and I just need to check facts. And with many books, you have to go to the index and then go to the page and then back to the index. But the source book, it's laid out. It's in chronological order. It goes chronologically through the investigation, or the murders and the investigation as they happened, and it's almost like a complete narrative of the Whitechapel murders and, well, Jack the Ripper murders.
Well, I wanted it to flow because I didn't want. For some people, it's going to be heavy reading because you're reading facts, you're reading police files, Home Office files, and that to some people can be totally boring because they're looking for a novel that involves a coach and a mad doctor going around murdering prostitutes, and it's not that at all. It's an examination of the facts that we know. And to do that, you've got to know the subject very well because, as you say, you've got to make a chronology out of it. Then you've got to blend police reports with Home Office reports and files so that the whole read as a continuing narrative, and then have connecting narrative to take it through the various chapters. And that's, I thought at the time, was the best way to do it, and that's how I did it. And again, that wasn't for a book, that was for my own use. Because I'd then got a document that I could search on the computer by word search to look things up, which was huge because there was no index to what I'd written. And also, there it was in hard copy, and this little red book I put together with all these files in, I used to carry everywhere I went. I'd go to Ripper meetings and I'd have it under my arm, and my little red book, and I'd look things up in there. And because you've got the instant answer to any question that anyone might put that involves facts, to say, well, no, that's not quite right, this is what was in the official report. So it was a useful document. And Jeremy Beadle, who's an old friend of mine, used to encourage me to do the book. He said, oh, you should do it, Stuart, do the book. And I said, well, I don't think anyone would buy it. I said it'd be too boring for people to read. No, I'd buy one, he said. I said, well, you could afford one, Jeremy, because it would cost something. And, people notoriously, if they're involved in something like this, don't want to spend a huge amount of money.
But the value of it, I mean, it offers genuine value for money. I mean, you take one look at it. I mean, this is no slim volume. I mean, this is a doorstopper. I mean, this could almost be the complete works of Shakespeare or a few Charles Dickens novels rolled into one, and such a valuable resource.
Yeah, it's quite comprehensive, but when I went to see the publisher, Constable Robinson, they wanted a book that could be published in America simultaneously, which it was, and they wanted it to contain basically new information. And I said to the publisher, I said, we won't get much more new information than you're going to get here because it's never been published. And they got a gentleman living, I think, somewhere down on Dartmoor, who was their resident Ripper expert, who they turned to for guidance on whether a book should be published or not. And he was sent my manuscript, and he said he'd never seen so much new information. Mm-hmm. So they instantly accepted the book. But I think it was running at about 188,000 words then, and he said it's not big enough though, we want a doorstop. I did expand it. Well, it was reportedly 250,000 words, so 250,000 words, and I did that by basically putting all additional material from newspapers, which were the factual reports of the inquest, because you knew that reporters were there, they took it in shorthand. By blending them all and cross-checking them, you could see, that generally they were pretty accurate. And so that was nice to bring in inquest reports where they didn't exist by taking them from the newspapers, such as the Times, Telegraph, and top papers like that.
And do you think there's going to be any new information, any information that surprises people? Are people going to be going through their loft and find a dusty old file that contains something nobody knew about or nobody knew existed? Or perhaps they're going through the archives and they make a big discovery that really does turn Ripperology on its head?
I have to say no. I mean, from the extant files, that there is no other sort of unknown information other than what may or may not exist in the special branch files, because I think we've all pretty well agreed there's special branch files missing. What they contain, we don't know. Certainly we know the Irish problem was part of the equation, and certainly we know Tumblety was a Ripper suspect, and we know he was a sympathiser with the Fenians. He was born in Dublin. I mean, he was Irish. So who knows? The only thing was, when I'd finished the Tumblety book, and it was a bit of a rush job, I had the co-author Paul Gainey, who was working with the Suffolk Police, and he helped by, I suppose he must have written about 50% of the book. We wrote about half of it each. I concentrated on the Ripper content because that was my forte, and then he did things like looking at the Lincoln assassination, because Tumblety was sort of involved there, and profiling and other aspects like that, which are things I preferred not to write about. And so it worked quite well, and we turned the book out in 10 months, which was incredible for this. So and Paul Gainey had to go to the States and do research over there. And unfortunately at that stage we didn't find that all-important interview with Tumblety from January 1889. That came along later. But when I finished the book, I did say, well, this is a book for an American to write, because Tumblety was American. That was where anything that was going to be found on him would be found. And I'd like to think that some capable researcher in the States, or researchers, would take the wand up for Tumblety and continue with the research, which is what happened. Excellent people over there like Roger Palmer, and we got Mike Hawley, who's turned out several books on it, and Joe Chetcuto. I mean, these people have done some fantastic research in the States, to the degree now where there's a lot of known murders in the States which look very, very suspiciously like prostitute murders of the Ripper ilk, and it can be proved that they're all in the vicinity, in different cities, of offices that Tumblety had, and the MO fits, and it's certainly looking good for the fact that he may have committed unknown murders of women in the States, because people say, oh, did he carry on killing in the States? Well, I mean, the sterling work Mike and Co have done is so good, and they quote the cases, and people can make their own decision.
So Mike Hawley and the others picked up the banner on Tumblety, as it were.
They have, yeah. They're carrying the flame for Tumblety. As I say, I don't and didn't particularly want to be cornered to say, oh, you're only interested in Tumblety, everything you say is going to be biased towards him. It's not. Yeah. I have to say that anything new that's found, whether it involves him or not, or indicates him or not, I always present it. If the odd bits and pieces I find, I'll put out there. People have to make their own decisions, and I think most of the Ripper enthusiasts are pretty well informed and enough books to read, and they do have to make their own decision. And there's some excellent authors about, as we know.
And the thing I find intriguing about Tumblety is he gets arrested, he skips bail, he goes back to America, and then there are articles about him appearing in the American press linking him to the Whitechapel murders. And yet these articles don't seem to have been mentioned in the English newspapers at the time.
No, that's something I've never been able to understand. I think now that things can be so easily researched on the BNA, the British Newspaper Archives, I mean, you've only got to put a name in and slip it in there, as you know, and anything that's known comes up. So I think one or two more little pieces on Tumblety have been found through that facility. Yeah. I don't think we're going to have any huge discoveries in the newspapers, but certainly there have been quite a lot of, I should say, probably important discoveries since all these books were written that add extra light on the case. Not necessarily with regard to Tumblety, but the whole case.
Well, we've mentioned the source book, but you've also done the book Letters from Hell with Keith Skinner, in which you reproduced many of the letters that came in that were signed by Jack the Ripper, purporting to come from the killer himself. And of course, the original of those letters was the Dear Boss letter. Do you think that was actually from the killer?
No, I don't. No, and I've stated this openly anyway. And of course, mention is made of that by Littlechild in his letter. And he actually states that it was a newsman of the Central News Agency who was the key mover there, and Tom Bulling. And certainly Bulling was known to wander around drunk in latter years, quoting, the Ripper case and the letters. And because the name Jack the Ripper was born of that first letter. There was a previous letter in the files dated the 24th, but totally not mentioning Jack the Ripper, but claiming to be the killer. So it's not even the first alleged letter from the killer. I think, it's amazing to look through all these well over 200 letters allegedly from the killer, and probably not one of them is actually from the killer.
Another book you've written, this one was with Don Rumbelow, is the book Scotland Yard Investigates. Again, another excellent book. What's nice about your books is that you don't just regurgitate or put out the same information book after book. Every one of your books is almost standalone, and there's new information in each one of them.
Well, I always said that I didn't want to follow the habit of some authors of regurgitating in slightly different form the information that's already been published. And I mean, people will get bored with it, surely. Certainly the letters had never been tackled, and I was chatting to Keith Skinner actually after we'd, started to collaborate together. And I said to Keith, you don't read much about the letters. What about a book on the letters? And I think Keith immediately thought, that would be a good book. Especially, obviously, you have to have the murders in it to make any sense of it. So it does have a narrative of the murders in it, and it does look at several of the known suspects, so that anyone who's that interested can say, perhaps I should look at his handwriting, compare it. So there are a few in there. I mean, there's one or two sort of non-starters, such as William Withy Gull, the Queen's physician. There's no way he was Jack the Ripper. But you've got to decide and plan these books, and carefully look at what you're doing. And in some ways, it's one of my favourite books. I actually dedicated it to Johnny Depp, because I did spend a bit of time in Prague with Johnny, and he told me he'd bought my first book. And so I sent him a copy of Letters from Hell, and because he was making the From Hell movie at the time, and dedicated the book to Johnny. And I think he takes quite a sensible overview of the murders.
And you're being a bit modest on that, because you didn't just spend time in Prague with Johnny Depp when he was filming From Hell. You were actually a consultant on the film From Hell to double check what was being said or what was going on in the film.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I did much of that, in all honesty. I was historical advisor along with Keith. Well, Keith and I did do an analysis of the script for 20th Century Fox before the film was started on. I pointed out a lot of valid points to them, but bearing in mind the book was based on the Alan Moore novel From Hell, they weren't in a position to change much. So I could say to them, it's an anachronism to feature Tower Bridge, because it wasn't there at the time of the murders. Just the foundations were being laid in, at the time of the murders. It wasn't, I think, completed in 1894. So where they have these moody scenes of London with Tower Bridge, it's going to look a bit silly if it wasn't there at the time of murder. So they took that out. But it was only factual things like that we could comment on. I mean, there was an attempt by Keith and myself to guide them in perhaps what might be a more fruitful or a more likely scenario, using known material that's in the files. But obviously they'd bought the graphic novel story, and that was it.
And that's quite an interesting point to make, isn't it? Because when films and dramas come out on the case, people often get up in arms about it, going, it's so inaccurate, that's wrong, so inaccurate. But of course, what people tend to forget is we're not talking about a documentary, it's a film.
I don't think you're going to need any factual movie of that ilk that's going to tell you the facts. I mean, it's there to entertain people, and I think one should always go into it with that in mind. I mean, if you want to decide who Jack the Ripper is, you're certainly not going to watch a Hollywood movie about it, because you're not going to get the facts that you should be getting. There'll be ones that suit the filmmakers. There's got to be drama, there's got to be mystery, there's got to be a bit of blood, and all the rest of it.
And yet I have to say that it was done in Prague, which is why you went to Prague to see Johnny Depp. But I have to say that recreation that they get of that area, or that little enclave where you have the 10 Bells, Christchurch, Spitalfields Market, Dorset Street, etc., that is so fantastic. It brings it almost back to life.
Yeah, it's very good. Yeah, I actually stood in Mary Kelly's bedroom on the site that they built at I think it was Orek village. It was outside Prague, but they took us out in a van to look at the set after they'd done the filming, because the coach was there lying on its side on the set when we went, and it was amazing. Yeah, they did some very good work on that, and the sets were very good.
But of course, the question I have to ask is, what was Johnny Depp like?
He's a very nice guy, I have to say that he bought my first book. Sorry, Johnny. But no, he's a very, very nice guy. He's very knowledgeable. He's a big collector, which I am. I mean, I've been led into all this by my never-ending quest to get hold of ephemera, and hence I got the Littlechild letter. and rare books. I've got 10,500 books in my collection, and he's a like soul, you know. I mean, he's very artistic. He's got a huge collection. Where other people collect first editions, Johnny collects the manuscripts. He can afford to, so he's well into his subjects, and I mean, he must have an incredible collection of his own.
And I have to say, having spent a lot of time being shown it by you, you yourself have got an absolutely incredible collection.
Yeah, it's a lot of years' work, and it hasn't always been an easy path when you've got a wife to keep happy. And suddenly you're going to go and buy a book for a couple of £1,000. It doesn't always go down well, but like I say, if somebody's a genuine collector, then usually you're collecting something that's worth something, and it's not going to go down in value. So it's a good investment, and I always look on it that way.
And what people might not realise is that when they see images of true crime or the Ripper images from the era, they might not realise that there's a good possibility those images have actually come from your collection.
They get ripped off all over the internet. Yeah. I mean, I know when. Well, I know that. I almost always know when the image is one of, I say ours because Keith and I do supply images for those who need them. But I always like to think that the images we supply are probably the best you'll find. Clarity, you know, and reproduction are probably the best you'll get hold of. So I mean, even today, I've been sending some photos off to America for a Ripper documentary. So, yeah, I mean, there's a certain amount of pride in it that you've. But I think people should share it. I think stuff should be made available if it's there, and then people are interested enough to read about it can see the best possible reproduction of what evidence there is.
And I have to say that your generosity and willingness to share your images is just fantastic. I mean, you've made images available to me to use in videos and other projects, and they're just superb. And one set of images you have made available to me are when you were 18, you came to London, you brought a camera, and with a map, you went round the murder sites and you photographed the sites which at the time still survived.
Yeah, such as they were then. That was in 1967. So I was able to rattle the door of 29 Hanbury Street and thought nothing of it. And George Yard buildings were still standing there. And Mitre Square was largely unaltered. I mean, there had been changes made, but you could easily recognise everything in the square. Not so Miller's Court, of course, because that was demolished many years before. But essentially, it looked very, probably very Victorian, you could say, because there weren't so many modern buildings about. The site in Berners Street was a school playground, so that probably looked very much the same when I went there as it does today. But they're easily recognisable, and it was nice to see them.
And you were telling me about the door of number 29 Hanbury Street, because the door knocker was something quite special and unusual.
You can actually see that in some of the clearer photos of 29 Hanbury Street. The door knocker is the starting handle of a car which has been attached to where the knocker was to knock the door, and you can see that quite clearly.
Was that around the time that James Mason visited number 29 for the film The London Nobody Knows?
That was the same year, I think. He was doing Unknown London, or whatever it's called.
Did you meet the lady who let him in when he knocked on the door?
No, I rattled the front door and knocked, but the house was either unoccupied or nobody was in. I tend rather to think it may have been unoccupied because it was demolished in the very early 70s. I also must admit to scraping some of the fading green paint off the door and keeping it in an envelope, which I took home with me, and unfortunately over the years it's disappeared. I still hope that one day I'm poking through the loft and I'll find this envelope with this fading green paint and say, this is off the front door of 29 Hanbury Street, but I don't hold out any hope of finding it.
And you were 18 at the time?
18, yeah, I was a mod. I used to walk around in an American Parker, the fishtail Parker, and roll around on a Lambretta scooter. And
with all the mirrors, did you have?
I didn't have a huge amount of mirrors. Okay. No, I always thought they rather got in the way. But it was a Lambretta GT200, which was probably top of the range for them at the time. And That's where all my money went when I was a teenager. That's why the only camera equipment I had when I went to the East End was a Brownie 127 camera with a 12-shot film in it. I couldn't afford anything else.
But but the photographs are so good. They're so clear.
In fact, it's lucky I've still got the original negatives, because my old friend Peter Underwood, I was corresponding with him in at the time, the centenary, 1987, and I actually sent my original negatives to Peter to use for his book, and his book had already gone to print, so they couldn't use them, and he kept them. I mean, I didn't ask for the negatives back, but when I started to get back into it again, I phoned him up. I said, Peter, do you think I could have my negatives back? And he did. He sent them back to me. So I've still got my original negatives.
So have you still got the original camera?
No, that went. But I mean, it served its purpose, and I've never had any sort of idea that I'm a great photographer, but just to actually take shots that people would be interested in one day was quite interesting.
Did it strike you at the time, the significance of what you were doing? Because you've got a genuine record of history there, because, of course, those sites have now long since vanished.
Yeah, I mean, I was highly embarrassed walking around looking at these murder sites, because I thought, well, all these locals must know what I'm doing, because everyone knows the Ripper murder site, especially if they lived in the East End. So I'm sort of shadily creeping around Bucks Row, or Durward Street as it was then, and taking these photos, and same in Hanbury Street and Galston Street, and well, no, I didn't get to Galston Street, oddly enough. Gunthorpe Street I went up to do the George Yard buildings, so I didn't even take all the photos I could have done had I had the resources. But the other thing I did, which was probably a little bit out of character for me, because I used to be quite self-conscious, I went into the London Hospital, and I knew about the articles in the London Hospital Gazette, and there was a big article by Professor Francis Camps, who was then a big pathologist, on the Ripper, and items they'd found in their archives at the hospital. And I actually managed to buy a copy of I think it was then 2 years later that I bought this article. That I spoke to the guy in the library. He said, I think we got some old copies, and he opened this drawer, and there was the copy I was looking for. So I actually got a copy of the original magazine, which I thought was a bit of a coup at the time.
This was when you were 18, isn't it?
When I was 18, yeah. £0.50 I paid for it. That's 2 and 6pence.
12 and a half new pence.
Yes.
So did you think at the time, I'm doing this for posterity, or was it just done purely for your own personal interest?
No, really, it was. I mean, I have to be honest. It was my own personal interest. I'd been interested in the Ripper for so long, and people say to me, "Oh, you used to be a policeman. Is that why you wrote Jack the Ripper books?" I said, "No, I was interested in Jack the Ripper before I ever joined the police force." I think one of the things, being a police officer, obviously doing reports of my own, and did nearly 30 years as a police officer, you fully understand the nature of police reports. I mean, I acted as coroner's officer, so I've given evidence in a coroner's court, used firearms, but that was in a different aspect of my work. But generally, when you get a police sort of mindset, you tend to look at things in a different way. And I think reading all the original, it's amazing how, looking at those reports from 1888, after I joined the police force, and sort of comparing it to how we were doing reports then, it hadn't changed that much. It was amazing, really, the way they were presented. So, and the fact that you understand evidence, and just what is it? There's circumstantial evidence. There's direct evidence. There's indirect evidence. There's circumstantial evidence. And when you understand it in all its forms, you can assess the value of what you're looking at, which has been a big help.
And when you look at those case files today, and you look at the police reports from 1888, I've always had this feeling that police will understand police no matter what era they're from. And so when you look back on that era, do you think the police had a determination to catch the killer? Do you think they had respect for the victims? How do you think those police conducted the investigation, and how they reacted to the investigation?
I mean, it's very difficult. I mean, people being people, individuals are all going to have different ideas and approaches, but I think they did a reason. I mean, people take the rise out of the police at the time. Oh, they were clowns. They didn't know what they were doing. I mean, especially Tumblety. He's very, very derogatory about the London police. But I think they got certain constrictions or constraints. It's not like a modern force where you're constantly in touch with the radio and you've got forensic evidence which can be gathered. And I think they did exceedingly well, really, for the short period it was going on, which wasn't long. The fact is, where are they going to get their evidence? You virtually had to catch a killer red-handed or have a witness who saw him do it. Otherwise, how are you going to prove it? I mean, somebody like Tumblety, who was so devious he would never tell the truth about anything like that anyway, there's no way you'd ever prove it, unless you caught him red-handed.
And of course, the newspaper reporting brought its own problems to the police investigation.
Well, the press loved it. I mean, the police were a favourite target. Matthews at the Home Office was a favourite target. And, let's have a go at Sir Charles Warren this week. And it was just a constant battle. I mean, we know that Sir Charles Warren resigned just before the whole thing blew over. But that was more to do with an article he'd written in Murray's magazine and about the Metropolitan Police, rather than perhaps, the success or non-success of his investigation.
Do you think Warren was a good commissioner?
Warren was a general in the army. I mean, none of these senior officers were actually policemen. They had, nowadays, or certainly when I was in the job, a chief constable will have joined the force as a police constable, and he'd have to work his way through the ranks, albeit probably more quickly than anyone who hadn't got such aspirations would do it. But certainly they all knew what police work was and had done it, in a practical sense, whereas Warren would have been as alien to him as it was to the average housewife. And he had his problems in being a general of the army as well, as witness his adventures in South Africa at the Battle of Spy on Kop. So he had a lot of criticism, but I don't think he was that much different to perhaps anyone else who would have been doing it. He was taken over by Munro. Munro didn't fare any better, really, in fighting Jack the Ripper. So, who knows? It's easy to criticise, but I think if you put critic in the place of the person who you're talking about, they wouldn't always perhaps do as good a job as the person who was there. So I think they did a reasonable job. And let's face it, the name Jack the Ripper did not emerge in a public sense till after the double event, after the 30th of September murders. So it wasn't even, they weren't even thinking in the terms of serial killer, big name Jack the Ripper, and until after, arguably until there was only one more victim left to come, which was Kenny.
Do you think releasing the Dear Boss Jack the Ripper letter and making it so public helped or hindered the police investigation?
Well, I don't know if it... Well, I think in the event it didn't help too much, but I think they were hoping somebody would recognise the handwriting. But then I think if they had, they would have recognised Tom Bulling's writing from the Central News Agency.
But that's an interesting thing, isn't it? Because Jack the Ripper and the Whitechapel murderer are in fact two different people. Jack the Ripper is the person who wrote that letter, and the Whitechapel murderer is whoever carried out the atrocities in the East End of London.
I mean, that's a good argument to make. It's very romantic to think he invented this wonderful name for himself that was going to become a buzzword into the 21st century. I mean, think of it, and hasn't even got a particularly high tally of victims. And yet here he is, probably always looked on as the major serial killer mystery, and such a big name. I mean, people are still interested in walking around looking at the sites such as they are. There's virtually nothing to see anyway.
No, exactly. Tell me about it.
It's held its head up, hasn't it, over the years, and is still sort of going strong now. And the books that are written, I don't think I'll be writing anymore, but I certainly enjoy being involved, and you meet wonderful people, other authors, and it's nice to say that I've known such sort of legends, shall we say, of the genre, such as Richard Whittington Egan, who was a very close friend of mine, and Jonathan Goodman, and Don Rumbelow, and Robin Odell. I think I've gained from knowing them, if nothing else.
And do you think the case would have had the longevity? Do you think the case would still be remembered today if he hadn't been given the name Jack the Ripper? Do you think the name is what kept it alive?
I think probably it is. I mean, we know the name Leather Apron was the first to emerge, and that was quickly forgotten because it didn't sound as good as Jack the Ripper. Would it have survived if he was just known as Leather Apron? Or I don't know. It's a difficult one to answer, but it is certainly a buzzword, isn't it? I think we can all agree on that. I mean, Don's always stressed what a buzzword the name is, and I think that's a large part of it. And the fact that he was never caught. I mean, that hits the romantic level then, doesn't it? Oh, he got away with. He fooled the whole police forces of London, you know. And people like to sort of read that sort of thing.
And of course, we've entered the era when detective fiction is becoming very, very popular. I mean, the first Sherlock Holmes story had come out the year before, in 1887. And I think it's safe to say, in the stories, you have these brilliant private detectives who just have almost superhuman powers. And the police are often portrayed as being dullards in those stories.
No, I think that's an interesting angle. Certainly, I've always said that, you know, people say to me, what's the appeal of these murders? I said, well, 1887, you've got A Study in Scarlet, is published in Beaton's annual. Then you've got the foggy streets, because they were foggy streets. There were, funny enough, no fogs at the time of the Ripper murders. At the time they happened, I think October 1888 was particularly foggy, but it's the gaslit streets, an unknown killer lurking in the darkness and getting away from all these policemen. But I mean, there was no concerted hunt for him until probably after the double event. I mean, up till then they knew that this is probably the same culprit for Nichols and possibly Martha Tavram and Chapman and so on, but it didn't really become something else until we got this, and of course it was international by then. They were reading about it in America, and that must be one of the first, well, it probably is the first serial killer in this country that's hit the international news, and it was a big thing, as we know, in America. I mean, there's Tumblety running round. Well, another thing with Tumblety that amazes me, you can look at any edition of the New York World in November, December, January 1888, 89, and there's his name as a Ripper suspect. Why had it been missed? Yeah. I can't understand why nobody found those reports prior to, you know, me being lucky enough to get hold of the Littlechild letter naming him.
That's interesting though, isn't it? Because he remains almost invisible until you found the Littlechild letter. And yet there he was in all the newspaper reports, but nobody had actually found those newspaper reports.
Well, they hadn't bothered looking, I don't think. Yeah. That's as simple as that.
I do think it's one of those problems we have, because there is so much information out there. It's a question of where to look, where to find the information. And of course, with a lot of the things, they remain hidden to us until somebody like you comes along from a completely different angle as a collector, and you find this information.
Yeah. I'd got no idea or intention to write any Ripper book at the time I got hold of that letter. I just thought, well, so many good authors have written about this subject. There's so much being written. What the hell can I add? And of course, at that time, I couldn't really add anything. So that is the thing that fired me off. But then I was in the fortunate, because I sold over 50,000 copies of my first book, which tended to make me in quite a good position with publishers to get another book published. So probably the next 3 or 4 books were quite easy to get accepted, because
well, that's bestseller territory, isn't it?
Well, yeah, it's only 5,000, I think, for a bestseller, you know, and I couldn't believe it. I mean, Letters from Hell sold, well, the first 20,000 copies were shipped to America. Most of the copies that went on sale in this country were technically second editions, although it didn't state it, but they had to run off another 12,000, I think it was, after they sold all these to America.
And Letters from Hell is such a wonderful book. I mean, the reproductions of the letters in here are just absolutely fantastic. They're just so crisp and so clear.
Yeah, they're pretty good. And I mean, it's all down to the publishers. It's not me. I think it's a wonderful dust wrapper. The fact there are so many of the letters in colour in the book, and it's high quality stock, and it's just a very, very nice book. And I was fortunate that, you know, they decided to do the job on it, and it certainly sold very well. And then I met Johnny, of course, and that might have helped boost sales a bit. I thought, well, he certainly deserves to get a mention in the front, so I put his name in the front and made sure he got a copy. But he's a very nice guy. I mean, he's very unassuming. I always tell the funny, well, it's not a funny story. He came down the stairs in the National Museum, in Prague. It's right at the top of Wenceslas Square, and it was doubling as the London hospital. And Johnny came trotting down the stairs dressed as Aberline, and I was at the bottom. And he'd obviously been told that I was down there, or he'd come down to see me. He said, Stuart Evans, and put his hand out to shake hands. And I should have said, who are you? You just don't think I could even dare to say such a thing. So sort of starstruck, I just shook hands with him. So that's always what I think is could you imagine doing it?
So Tumblety's name isn't in any of the official files or the official records that have survived that we have today. But his name must have been in a file, because Littlechild says that there was an extensive dossier about him at Scotland Yard.
Yeah, that's just something we can't answer now. It's too far in the past. There are references. His name's mentioned twice in the newspapers of November 1888. So he does get mentioned, but in a very peripheral way. And nobody had obviously stumbled across, I think it's 2 or 3 reports. Probably a few more have been found now. As they gradually digitalise the newspapers, there are more references being found that we hadn't known about before. And there'll always be bits cropping up. I think the pursuit for a lot of people is just to add something new to the case in some shape or form. And that's not to be decried, and I think it's good if people do find something. It won't be me, because I'm not searching anymore. I've had to realise there's more in life than Jack the Ripper.
Just to return briefly to the Littlechild letter, the way the letter came about was that George Sims, the journalist, wrote to Littlechild to ask him if he'd heard of a Dr. D in connection with the Whitechapel murders. Littlechild wrote back to say he hadn't heard of a Dr. D, but he'd heard of a Dr. T. And then we get the Tumblety. The letter then is part of George Sims' collection. So,
yeah. I mean, all I know is that Eric Barton, who owned the letter, the book dealer from Richmond who owned it, I think he bought it in the early 60s. Obviously knew who George Sims was, and probably unfairly to Eric, some people called him the Ghoul of Richmond Hill, because he used to pursue widows. When he read of some figure like Sims dying, he'd go running to them and say, to the widow, and say, can I help you with, selling or disposing of some of the estate? Which he's probably supplying a good service, but because it was a good service for himself. I'm very glad that Eric came to me with that letter, because he could have gone to anybody, and fortunately it was me. So I mean, there's lots and lots of luck plays its part in these things. I'm no brilliant researcher who's sort of stayed up until midnight with the oil lamp going and suddenly come up with good things. I do search out ephemera, so that's basically how I came by it. And an important part of that is, and your dealers are probably amongst your best contacts, is to let them know what you're interested in. I mean, I spent a lot of time with Camille Wolfe. She was a wonderful lady, and probably the top crime dealer in London at the time, crime book dealer. And she was contacted by Eric and contacted me, and that's as simple as that. That's just luck. I mean, I haven't done some brilliant research to find it.
But it's making the contacts, and your name's there when people.
Yeah, that helps. Yeah, I mean, well, it wouldn't have happened if I hadn't, but. I do really feel very grateful to people such as Eric and Camille for the part they played. I mean, there was a funny bit. People say, "Oh, how much did you pay for those letters?" And I say, "Well, that's not really for me to say, and it's for me to know, and I don't really want to go around shouting about how much I paid and so on." I said, but the funny thing was when they did the documentary the following year, they did a documentary, Secret History, on Tumblety and the book. There were various interviews done with Eric at his house in Richmond, and a question was put to him. I watched the takes of a lot of it. Wasn't used in the programme that went out, and one of them was that he was being interviewed, and they said, "Oh, what do you think about this letter you sold to Mr. Evans and what it might be worth?" And they said, "How much do you think it's worth?" And Eric said, "About £1 million," he said, which of course is a nonsense, but he said it, and I think he did sort of wish he'd done his homework before he sold the letter. But c'est la vie, I mean, it's luck of the draw, especially if you've got a dealer who you assume would probably know exactly what he's dealing with.
And George Sims, by the time he died, had amassed quite an extensive crime collection. Do we know where much of that collection went?
Well, I think it's spread to the four winds. Yeah. I mean, you can look up sales. I mean, I often scour Victorian and Edwardian and past newspapers to see where did some of this stuff go. And there were quite a few big articles on Sims, especially at the time he died. They went to his house and interviewed his wife, and there's a picture of her sitting there, and there's all this crime stuff. And I think probably a lot went to Madame Tussauds, funny enough, because they were buying a lot of crime stuff. And in fact, Eric Barton mentioned to me that a lot of the stuff that he could have had already gone to Madame Tussauds, and some he actually sold to them himself. So he was probably very much ending up at the thin end of the wedge and getting what was left over when the cream of the collection had gone to Tussauds. And they have got a fine, well, they did have a fine crime collection. I don't know where it is now. But certainly there was some good stuff there, and I got quite a lot of. They were very good in assisting me with the biography of the hangman James Berry when I wrote his biography. They had an unpublished manuscript, biological manuscript on James Berry, and they had a lantern slide collection that he used to go around, tour around giving, talking about crime and punishment and the part it played, and illustrating executions, and not real ones, but posed executions and things like that for these talks that he did. The thing was, when I went down to the Chamber of Horrors, and I'm amazed I was allowed down there at the tender age of about 7, it was quite a horrifying place. It was a proper cellar, and the support arches and stone and bells tolling in the background, and it was quite a spooky place. I think the only way to get an idea of it, there was a film made in the 30s, I think it was, Murder at Midnight, or Murder at Madame Tussauds, and that they actually used the Chamber of Horrors, the real one, in the making of that film, and you do get the genuine atmosphere watching that, because they had a complete gallows in there from Hertford Jail. Amazingly, that was later broken up to make a set that they'd done for the Christie execution years later, and I thought they destroyed that valuable ancient gallows. They just tore it apart. Stuff that's been lost, is incredible. But having said that, they did have I don't know what it's like now, but they did have a nice archive, and you were able to get in touch, and they'd help all they could. Yeah.
So with your knowledge of Tumblety, I've got to ask you this. Would you buy medication off him?
Well, looking at his track record, and that's genuine, especially the inquest that was held on one of his patients that died. No, I don't think I would. The amazing thing was, in Canada, he was doing abortions, before the Ripper murders. And so there are lots of things that you stop and think, and he published 2 or 3 books praising himself and saying how wonderful he was and that, but in one of them, the 1889 one, there's a section on Bright's disease, and people sort of quote Eddowes in that connection because of the missing kidney, and that, although you can't classify and say something's Bright's disease because it's sort of a cross section of renal ailments, she had the symptoms that pointed at something like Bright's disease. So again, it's only coincidental, I would venture to suggest, but he does look at Bright's disease in this book he did. A very, very strange character, it has to be said. But, we just don't know, and we never will know. I mean, people say, oh, well, it's Tumblety, was it? And I say, no, I don't know. I've made out a case for Tumblety based on, and I'd rather not written that book, because now everyone says, oh, you're the Tumblety man, and that's the end of that. And I like to think, well, no, I've done a bit more than, look how many years I was interested in the case. I was first interested in reading about it in 1961, and it wasn't until 1993 that Tumblety was ever found. So most of my life I was looking at people like Druitt and Kosminski, and didn't even know about Tumblety. So on the strength of what I found, I think you can safely say he was definitely on the suspect list. He was definitely a very likely suspect, if not least of all, because Littlechild tells us he was. But Littlechild wasn't saying, I know who Jack the Ripper was, it was Dr. Tumblety. He says it in a very modest way and saying, well, he was a very likely suspect. He knew they couldn't prove it. He wouldn't have been released on bail if they could prove it. So they tried to hold him down, on those section offences, which didn't work because he jumped bail. But he was an exceedingly rich man.
He was incredibly wealthy, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was, yeah. So who knows? I don't know. I always say to people, look, I can tell you what I think, and you can read whatever books you like, because you need to. There's several key Ripper books you must read to get an overall opinion and get a book that attacks Tumblety as a suspect, and does the case hold up against him, doesn't it? And the only thing I disagree with is when people dismiss things out of hand. I mean, Martin Fido, who's over the years a very good friend of mine, but Martin used to say, "Oh no, he wasn't Jack the Ripper, he was homosexual," Okay, well, we've got modern day cases of serial killers who are homosexual, killing women and mutilating them. So it falls down on that alone. But you can also look at the fact that he had some bee in his bonnet about women. There's absolutely no doubt of that at all. He very, as Littlechild says, his feelings against women were very bitter in the extreme. I mean, there was something there that was motivating that. And what can you say? You just have to assess all these remarks and do your reading and then draw your conclusions. And
I think that's an important point, actually, because you really should question everything to do with the case. You shouldn't just accept what somebody tells you.
But I would warn anyone writing a Ripper book, you're putting your head above the battlements and prepare for some flack.
I think today, if you have got any new opinions, new theories, or new information, and you put it out there on the forums and go public with it, it's almost like jumping into the lion's den.
It is, yeah, and I mean, fair enough. If so some people like to conduct themselves, fair enough, let them get on with it. But I have to say that when I ducked out of it all, I was rather pleased at how much better I felt.
You felt better.
I honestly do think, though, that anyone who comes up with a new theory or does personal research or in-depth research or any research really, and you might not agree with them completely, but I think everybody who does their own research and everyone who investigates from a different perspective, they bring something new to the table.
Well, definitely. I mean, I can say the years that I was close, because if you're going to be a so-called Ripper expert, which I've already said that I don't think there is such an animal, because you're never going to know everything about every suspect but if there's somebody who's, I like to say Ripper authority, I think that sounds a better description if you know a bit about the case. I always say I'm a Ripper authority, but I wouldn't say I'm an expert. And the thing is, it carries a heavy responsibility, because some of your readers are going to, everything you say, they're going to set their own thoughts on and think, oh yeah, and well, that's fine, that's their decision. But I will say, I like to think, and I think I have been totally honest about everything I've published. And I was expected to reveal Jack the Ripper and say, a grand announcement at the end of the Tumblety book, we found Jack the Ripper. Like some people have actually put that in their books. Yeah. We have found
Case
Jack
closed.
the Ripper. And yeah, I wasn't prepared to do that. In fact, I told the publisher that. I said, no, I'll present it for what it is and give the best possible interpretation on the facts as known. But I'm not going to stray from the facts. I mean, and if you don't know, you say you don't know. And people just have to decide and make their minds up.
And I know you say you're out of the field now, but there can honestly be few people who've made a bigger contribution to the field, so as it were, than you.
It's very kind of you to say so, but there are many legends in it. I mean, a lot must be owed, and I've told them this, they know it. And at some stage or other, they've been good friends of mine. There's Paul Begg and Martin Fido and Keith Skinner, who were three of the top names when you moved into the 90s. And, they were the go-to people on the Ripper. And I went to them, and they were doing very good work. And really the first ones to have a solid foundation in the facts and looking at the files. And I have to say their work assisted me greatly when I started doing it. You have to disentangle yourself from involvement with other people at some stage and start visiting the original sources yourself, because they're not always garnered correctly. Sometimes a mistake will creep into one book, and then it just feeds on to all subsequent books because people don't bother to check the facts. And I'm guilty on one occasion of doing that myself, taking the easy option of resorting to what I thought was a very good reference work to do. Luckily it wasn't on one of the main murders, but to put something in a book, and it was incorrect. And a very old friend of mine, another old friend, Phil Sugden, who was an academic writer on the Ripper, wonderful man, he looked at it for mistakes. I gave him the manuscript. He says, you got that wrong. He says, I know where you got that information from. And he was able to tell me where I'd copied it from. And the reason I hadn't consulted it in the official records was because I'd boxed them all up and put them in my loft, and I couldn't be bothered to climb up into the loft to get the original files. I used that reference work because I thought, well, it's going to be right. And it wasn't.
And Philip Sugden, of course, was the author of the complete history of Jack the Ripper.
I still think that's probably, if you want an unbiased look, probably the best Ripper book available to. He was a fantastic man. And I've never known somebody, it wasn't his subject. He was into crime research. He was very interested in highwaymen and things like that. But he went the extra mile in his research, and he was an academic. He was at Hull University, and he was a lecturer, and nice guy all round.
Well, in closing now, I've just got to ask you, do you think the case will ever be solved?
No, I think I can categorically say that no, it will never be solved. We will never know who Jack the Ripper was. All you can do is keep looking at what's published and what there is, and the individual has to draw his own conclusions. You can't rely on any one person. Nobody can rely on me and then come out and say, oh, well, I know who the Ripper is. I've read Stuart Evans' books. No, you don't. You know basically what I've put into print, and you might use that as a basis to make your assessment on, but that's all it is. It's not the answer. It could be the answer, but we'll never know. I mean, I've stated that on TV before in interviews. I said, well, no, I don't know Dr. Tumblety was a Ripper. I do know that the Chief Inspector of Special Branch, who was there at the time of the murders, has said he's a very likely suspect. And if Chief Inspector Littlechild said that, he knows more than you do. Or knew more than you do.
Right.
He's got to.
Well, Stuart, I'd just like to say thank you very much for taking the time. And it's been great speaking with you. And we meet at last.
We meet at last, yes. The name's constantly been past my eyes. And it's strange we haven't met, but there.
But we have now.
Perhaps because I don't do Ripper walks.
That could be it.